And now came the moment of battle that tried us severely. Not that there was a sign of hesitancy or a show of poor behavior, but it is terrible to march slowly into danger and see and feel that each second your chance for death is surer than it was the second before. The desire to break loose, to run, to fire, to do something, no matter what, rather than to walk is almost irresistible. We were under fire and advancing at a brisk walk, closed in mass, 10 ranks deep. We were almost as good a target as a barn.
Union Lieutenant John Meade Gould described his regiment's experience as they marched into battle at Antietam on September 17, 1862, which would become the bloodiest single day of combat in American history. The battle marked the end of Robert E. Lee's Maryland campaign. Following his victory at the Second Battle of Manassas, General Lee brought his army across the Potomac and into Maryland, invading the North. He wanted to move the conflict out of his beloved Virginia and to draw fresh troops from a Maryland that he expected would greet his men as liberators. Though Maryland remained with the Union, it was a slave state. Many in Maryland were sympathetic to the Southern cause. Lee believed that these were the men who would join his army if they were given the chance. Lee and Confederate President Jefferson Davis also hoped that a successful Northern campaign would encourage the European powers to lend political and military support to the Confederacy, as well as influence the upcoming midterm elections in the Union, putting more peace Democrats in Congress. The recent Confederate success at the Second Battle of Bull Run, or Second Manassas, had some European leaders leaning toward recognizing the Confederacy as a legitimate government and treating with both the CSA and the USA as two separate nations. And in the Union, the public was frustrated with Lincoln's failure to end the war quickly. A successful invasion, Lee and Davis hoped, could indeed hasten the end of the war, but not to the Union's benefit. Lee believed he would face minimal resistance, as the Union Army of the Potomac was demoralized by its loss at Manassas and would take weeks to reorganize. Upon reaching Frederick, Maryland, Lee drew up a proclamation to the people of Maryland. It declared that his army had arrived to help them throw off the foreign yoke of oppression by the U.S. government. But the people of Maryland did not greet Lee with open arms. Many, if not most, secessionist-leaning Marylanders had long since gone south and had already joined the Confederate forces. Those who remained were appalled at the invasion. Furthermore, Lee's bedraggled, hungry, poorly clothed army did not inspire young men to join their cause. Lee then divided his forces, sending Stonewall Jackson with about half of the army to capture Harper's Ferry, seizing the weapons and ammunition stored there and securing his lines of supply further south. General Jackson and his 30,000 troops were able to overwhelm the 12,000 Union troops in place at Harper's Ferry. The rest of Lee's army moved northwest toward Hagerstown, Maryland, across South Mountain. But another of the Southern commander's assumptions proved incorrect. Rather than taking weeks to reorganize Union forces, General George McClellan accomplished it in days. General John Pope was relieved of his command following the disaster at Second Manassas. His Army of Virginia was folded into McClellan's Army of the Potomac. McClellan's superior organizational skills and the love his men had for their Little Mac reinvigorated the Northern forces as they marched into Maryland to head off the invasion. The Union Army moved into Frederick just days after Lee's army had departed. Upon learning of the proximity of the Union forces, Lee sent word to all his commanders to regroup outside of Sharpsburg, Maryland, near Antietam Creek. Unfortunately for Lee, McClellan received a copy of Lee's orders on September 13th. With these in hand, McClellan had an opportunity to take his larger force and destroy Lee's army in pieces. But McClellan was ever cautious, always overestimating the size of his enemy's forces. He moved slowly, cautiously, and by the time he committed his troops to battle on September 17th, most of Lee's troops had joined him near Sharpsburg. The armies fought across open fields and cornfields, along roads and next to a bridge later named for Union General Burnside. Lieutenant Gould described his regiment's experience.
The fire of the enemy became more galling every step we took, and one man after another fell. The battle had been terribly severe to us, engaged as we were at close quarters, and with troops that had seen so much more fighting than we had. The well-aimed bullets of the rebels as they went zipping past us, killing and wounding our comrades, and sometimes cutting spitefully through our clothes, made us the most nervous, of course.
The battle at Antietam saw 23,000 casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. A quarter of the Army of the Potomac, and over 30% of the Army of Northern Virginia. Over 6,000 American soldiers, North and South, lost their lives on that day of battle. As historian James M. McPherson notes, American casualties at Antietam were 4 times greater than American losses at Normandy on June 6, 1944. Despite his losses on the 17th, General Lee and his army stood their ground when dawn broke on the 18th. They stood facing McClellan's larger army, which included 20,000 fresh reserves who had not fought the previous day, and they prepared themselves for attack. But that attack never came. Eventually, Lee withdrew his forces across the Potomac. From one perspective, neither side won that bloody battle. Despite being greatly outnumbered, Robert E. Lee's superior generalship had allowed his smaller army to inflict significant damage on the Union forces. At the same time, General McClellan's hesitancy and his decision to hold a third of his army in reserve prevented the Army of the Potomac from smashing Lee's army once and for all. Although McClellan was able to build a great army for Lincoln, he was not able to use it. Lieutenant Charles Brewster of the 10th Massachusetts was working at a recruiting station in Cambridge when he learned of the results at Antietam. He wrote in a letter home to his mother,
I see the news begin to grow less favorable to our side in the late battles. At first they were going to bag the whole rebel army. Now they are driven back into Virginia, which is not the place to bag them by a long shot.
But though McClellan might have been able to accomplish far more than he did at Antietam, it was nonetheless a strategic Union victory. Lee's army was stopped short. The Northern invasion had failed. The Army of Northern Virginia returned to Virginia. The loss at Antietam put a halt to chances of European recognition of the Confederacy. Karl Marx, living in London, had been following the American Civil War closely, writing numerous articles about it. In October 1862, stating what many had already agreed upon, he wrote,
"The short campaign in Maryland has decided the fate of the American Civil War. However much the fortune of war may still vacillate between the opposing parties for a shorter or longer time."
In the elections in November, although the Peace Democrats would capture more seats than they had previously held, Lincoln's Republican Party would maintain control of the House of Representatives. Combined with the Unionists, who were also committed to preserving the Union through military means, they controlled the majority vote. The Maryland invasion had failed in all of its goals. But the suffering of Antietam was felt by both sides. Second Lieutenant B.F. Blakesley of the 16th Connecticut Volunteers wrote,
"In a room about 12 by 20 feet, a bloody table stood, and around it were 5 surgeons. A wounded man was laid on the table, and it took but a few seconds for them to decide what to do, but a few minutes to do it. The amputated limbs were thrown out of a window. In 48 hours, there were as many as 2 carts of loaded amputated legs, feet, arms, and hands in the pile. Plenty of men, most of them slightly wounded, were hard at work carrying the wounded to and fro, making beds of straw, hauling and cutting wood, and assisting in 1,000 ways."
Antietam looms large in American memory, not simply because of the long casualty lists, but because it was the first major battle to be thoroughly documented by photography. Photographer Alexander Gardner, working for noted photographer Matthew Brady, brought the images of the true horrors of war home to Americans for the first time. Brady exhibited these photographs in his New York gallery. On October 20th, 1862, the New York Times described the effect these images had on civilians back home.
Mr. Brady has done something to bring home to us the terrible reality and earnestness of war. If he has not brought bodies and laid them in our dooryards and along the streets, he has done something very like it. At the door of his gallery hangs a little placard, "The Dead of Antietam." Crowds of people are constantly going up the stairs. You will see the hushed, reverent groups standing around these weird copies of carnage, bending down to look in the pale faces of the dead. We should scarce choose to be in the gallery, when one of the women bending over them should recognize a husband, a son, or a brother in the still, lifeless lines of bodies that lie ready for the gaping trenches.
Those lifeless lines of bodies weighed on President Lincoln. But what frustrated him most about the battle at Antietam was the series of missed opportunities. Yes, General McClellan had succeeded in stopping Robert E. Lee's invasion of Maryland, but General Lee had succeeded in preventing his own army's destruction at the hands of the Army of the Potomac. While Lincoln was glad to have the immediate threat removed, he saw the failure to smash Lee's army after Antietam as a lost opportunity to end the war. Lincoln had expected McClellan to follow after Lee, striking hard while the Confederate forces were still reeling from their losses at Antietam and were still far from home. Lincoln visited McClellan at his headquarters near Antietam in the first week of October. At that point, the Army of the Potomac had sat still for over 2 weeks. He urged McClellan then to pursue the enemy quickly while the time was right. But McClellan did not move. Lincoln followed his visit with telegrams that continued to push McClellan to take action. He instructed his general-in-chief, Henry Halleck, to order McClellan to cross the Potomac and give battle. But McClellan did not move. Finally, on November 7th, Lincoln removed McClellan from command, replacing him with General Ambrose Burnside. But though McClellan did not achieve the level of success that Lincoln believed possible, the end of the Northern invasion and Lee's retreat to Virginia did give Lincoln the opportunity he needed for something else. In the North, abolitionist pressure was building for a general emancipation of all slaves. Lincoln knew that he would need a substantial Union military victory first, or else the move would seem like an act of desperation, and therefore might draw more resistance than support in the North. Lincoln also feared what emancipation efforts would do to the support of the border states. On multiple occasions, he met with delegates from these states in an attempt to get them to accept some process of gradual emancipation whereby the federal government would financially reimburse slave owners for their loss of property. But the offer was flatly refused. Months earlier, Congress was able to force the issue in the District of Columbia. In April 1862, about a year after the war began, Congress abolished slavery in the district and compensated former slave owners with payments of $300 per slave. It was the beginning of emancipation in America. Even in the North, there was resistance to the idea of large numbers of free blacks intermingling with whites. White workers feared the competition they might face, competing against workers whose experience was to labor without pay. Racist fears dovetailed with economic ones, as foes of emancipation warned of black men taking up with the daughters of white men. Anti-slavery forces resisted this backlash and stressed that emancipation would help the war effort. Lincoln, as ever, sought to preserve the Union. As he said,
"My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. I shall do less whenever I shall believe what I am doing hurts the cause, and I shall do more whenever I shall believe doing more will help the cause."
But even as he said this, Lincoln had been making plans to take action on emancipation using the war powers granted to the commander-in-chief. He just needed that military victory. Antietam provided that victory, and on September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued a proclamation which declared that all slaves living in states that were in rebellion as of January 1, 1863, would be free. Slaves living in the border states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri were not included in Lincoln's proclamation, nor were those living in Confederate states, but within areas controlled by the Union. But this still meant that over 3 million slaves had been freed under the law by the stroke of a pen. Lincoln said at the time,
"I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper."
Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation changed the political nature of the war. Before, Lincoln might have accepted the peaceful return of the Confederate states and allowed them to retain their constitutions and their slaves. But now, no peace could be made without the South surrendering its slaves or the Union surrendering its states. While the Army of the Potomac was fighting off Robert E. Lee's invasion of Maryland in the east, the Union's Army of the Ohio was battling against a Confederate invasion of Kentucky in the west. Confederate General Braxton Bragg had led his Army of the Mississippi into Kentucky in August 1862. Like Lee, Bragg hoped to draw support from Confederate sympathizers in this border state. He also sought to draw Union Major General Don Carlos Buell out of Tennessee. Buell had reinforced General Grant at Shiloh in April and later participated in the month-long siege of Corinth, Mississippi in May. He then began a slow march toward Chattanooga, Tennessee. Bragg found in Kentucky what Lee found in Maryland. Whatever sympathies the border states might have toward the Confederacy, they were not enough to deliver Bragg the men he hoped to recruit. But Bragg did succeed in drawing Buell out of Tennessee. On October 7th, Buell's Army of the Ohio clashed with Bragg's forces at Perryville, Kentucky. After smaller skirmishes on the 7th, fighting began in earnest on the 8th. A Union division assaulted the Confederate line near Peters Hill. A Confederate division struck the Union's left flank, forcing it back. As more Confederate divisions joined in the assault, the Union line was forced back. Some of the Union units were in full rout, but the commanders were able to stabilize the line, forcing the Confederates to a halt. John Beatty, who was commissioned as a brigadier general in the 3rd Ohio Infantry for his performance at Perryville, wrote in his journal that day,
"Nearly 200 of my 500 men now lay dead and wounded on the little strip of ground over which we fought. They have long sought for a battle and often been disappointed and sore because they failed to find one. But now, for the first time, they really realize what a battle is. They see it is to men what an Arctic wind is to autumn leaves, and are astonished to find that any have outlived the furious storm of deadly missiles. The enemy is in the woods before us, and as the sentinels occasionally exchange shots, we can see the flash of their guns and hear the whistle of bullets above our heads. The two armies are too near to sleep comfortably or even safely, so the boys cling to their muskets and keep ready for action. It is a long night, but it finally comes to an end."
Union forces took 4,200 casualties at Perryville, and the Confederates took 3,200. As with Antietam, at Perryville, the Confederates could point to their ability to stand up to a larger force and inflict more casualties than they received. In truth, however, the Battle of Perryville was a tactical stalemate, and it was a strategic victory for the Union. As with Lee's Maryland invasion, Bragg's Heartland offensive into Kentucky was shut down, and his army retreated to Tennessee. Buell, like McClellan, failed to follow his enemy and strike quickly in East Tennessee as Lincoln had wished. Lincoln removed Buell from command. The Union's western forces were reorganized, and Buell's Army of the Ohio was folded into the new Department of the Cumberland under Major General William Rosecrans. In the East, General Burnside had replaced McClellan as the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Although Burnside had distinguished himself in a few earlier operations, he did not believe himself ready for command of the full army. But when told that the commander would be either him or his rival, Joe Hooker, he reluctantly accepted the post. Burnside immediately demonstrated that he was willing to seek the fights that McClellan would not. He planned a bold, fast march to Fredericksburg, Virginia. There he would cross the Rappahannock River and then advance along the railroad line to Richmond. He was positioned to get there ahead of Lee, cutting the rebel general off from his main base of operations. The Army of the Potomac set out on November 15th, and within 2 days, Burnside's advance elements reached the north side of the Rappahannock. The Confederates had long since destroyed the bridges across the river. Burnside's plan called for pontoon bridges to be quickly sent to the front and assembled for the army, now 120,000 strong, to cross. This is where Burnside's plan fell apart. A series of administrative failures delayed the bridges for 17 days, more than enough time for Lee to arrange his forces. Lee's artillery and infantry were dug in. Crossing the Rappahannock would be a bloody affair. Burnside arranged his forces into 3 grand divisions. Major General Edwin Sumner commanded the right grand division, Major General Joseph Hooker the center, and Major General William Franklin the left. Each division included 2 corps of infantry plus cavalry. Confederate Lieutenant General James Longstreet later recounted,
"On the morning of the 11th of December, 1862, an hour or so before daylight, the slumbering Confederates were awakened by a solitary cannon thundering on the heights of Marie's Hill. The aroused Confederates recognized the signal of the Washington artillery and knew that the Federal troops were preparing to cross the Rappahannock. Until 1 o'clock this contest lasted, when the Federals, with angry desperation, turned their whole force of artillery on the little city and sent down from the heights a perfect storm of shot and shell, crushing the houses with a cyclone of fiery metal. From our position on the heights, we saw the batteries hurling an avalanche upon the town, whose only offense was near its edge in a snug retreat, nestled 3,000 Confederate hornets that were stinging the Army of the Potomac into a frenzy. But in the midst of all this fury, a little brigade of Mississippians clung to their work. At last, when I had everything in readiness, I sent a peremptory order to Barksdale to withdraw, which he did, fighting as he retired before the Federals, who had by that time succeeded in landing a number of their troops.
Sumner's division secured the town of Fredericksburg and then looted it, smashing whatever they could find in the abandoned homes. On the 13th, Union troops began their attack on the Confederate line. On the left, south of the town, Franklin's division was stopped short by Stonewall Jackson's artillery. On the right, Hooker's divisions had to cross a sunken road and a mile of open ground to capture Marie's Heights. Longstreet commanded the defense there.
This was just where we had expected attack, and I was prepared to meet it. As the troops massed before us, they were very much annoyed by the fire of our batteries. The field was literally packed with Federals from the vast number of troops that had been massed in the town. From the moment of their appearance began the most fearful carnage. With our artillery from the front, right, and left tearing through their ranks, the Federals pressed forward with almost invincible determination, maintaining their steady step and closing up their broken ranks. Thus resolutely they marched upon the stone fence behind which they quietly waited the Confederate brigade of General Cobb. As they came within reach of this brigade, a storm of lead was poured into their advancing ranks, and they were swept away from the field like chaff before the wind.
Union troops made 7 charges at the Marie's Heights, all resulting in the same terrible result.
When night came to end the dreadful carnage, and the Federals withdrew, leaving the battlefield literally heaped with the bodies of their dead. Before the well-directed fire of Cobb's brigade, the Federals had fallen like a steady dripping of rain from the eaves of our house. Our musketry alone killed and wounded at least 5,000, and these, with the slaughter by the artillery, left over 7,000 killed and wounded before the foot of Marie's Hill. The dead were piled sometimes 3 deep, and when morning broke, the spectacle that we saw upon the battlefield was one of the most distressing I ever witnessed.
Union casualties were staggering. Almost 12,700 men, including 1,300 killed and 9,600 wounded. Lee's Army of Virginia suffered less than half those losses. Burnside withdrew his forces across the river, his advance toward Richmond thwarted. In the west, General Rosecrans, the new commander of the Army of the Cumberland, was settled in Nashville. Despite repeated urging by the War Department, Rosecrans had refused to move against Confederate General Bragg. He took his time reorganizing, resupplying, and training his men in Nashville. Finally, the day after Christmas, 1862, Rosecrans marched from the city in 3 columns, seeking the enemy. Bragg, meanwhile, was in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. He was struggling against subordinate generals who had sent a request to Jefferson Davis to have Bragg removed and replaced by General Joseph E. Johnston. Davis determined not to remove Bragg, but neither did he remove the fractious generals under him. Rosecrans marched his over 80,000 men toward Murfreesboro, harassed along the way by Confederate Brigadier General Joseph Wheeler's cavalry. Rosecrans was forced to leave about half his force along the way to guard his rear and supply lines from Wheeler's attacks. On December 30th, Rosecrans found Bragg's army in a strong position astride Stones River, blocking the way to Chattanooga. Rosecrans and Bragg developed identical battle plans, each planning to envelop the enemy's right flank. The Confederates seized the initiative, striking at dawn on December 31st. A Confederate corps, supported by cavalry, struck the Union right. They quickly pushed the defending Union troops back. Meanwhile, Wheeler's cavalry was wreaking havoc. Transports of wounded soldiers back to Nashville required heavy escorts, pulling men from the Union line. The Union's right flank was bent back, though by afternoon, the Confederate assault had bogged down. The following day, New Year's, both sides sat warily facing each other. Bragg believed that Rosecrans was planning a retreat, which indeed many of Rosecrans' officers were advising. But the Union forces were digging in. When Bragg attacked the Union left wing on January 2nd, massed Union artillery stopped them cold, and Union counterattacks pushed the Confederate right flank back. Rosecrans received resupplies and reinforcements on January 3rd. Bragg could see now that the Army of the Cumberland wasn't going to retreat and would instead continue to receive fresh troops. Bragg had only 20,000 effectives at this point, and Rosecrans could soon have more than 3 times as many. Bragg withdrew to the south, and Rosecrans occupied Murfreesboro. Though the battle had achieved little tactically, it was a powerful morale boost for the Union. Lincoln wrote to Rosecrans, "You gave us a hard-earned victory, which had there been a defeat instead, the nation could scarcely have lived over." The Confederate threat to Kentucky and Middle Tennessee had been halted. Rosecrans dug massive earthworks at Murfreesboro, which served as a Union supply depot until the end of the war. Back in the East, Burnside made another disastrous attempt on Fredericksburg. This time, his plan was to take advantage of the unusually dry weather to move his troops a few miles up the Rappahannock, where they could cross at fords. They set out on January 19th and continued their progress over dry, frozen ground on the 20th. Finally, his army completely mired, Burnside called a halt to the Mud March. Not surprisingly, perhaps, Burnside's subordinate generals were unhappy with their commander. As had happened with the Confederate commander Bragg, Burnside's subordinates took their complaints to the president. Furious, Burnside demanded that either he or his subordinates be removed. Unlike Jefferson Davis, Lincoln removed the commander. Burnside was transferred to command the Department of the Ohio. Major General Joseph Hooker was given command of the Army of the Potomac. Nicknamed Fighting Joe by journalists, he had a reputation for bold action as a division and corps commander. John Meade Gould described the change.
Hooker put life into everything, a very much needed life, as it was, too, and his most important act, in a soldier's estimation, was the providing of good rations. From our first arrival at Stafford Court House, we began to improve in every way. We had drills and dress parades as often as the weather would permit. Inspections by general and staff officers were made more frequently than ever before. When they saw anything worth complimenting, they did it in writing. Much praise was due McClellan for his success with raw troops after Bull Run. But Hooker taught old soldiers and made 100 improvements upon an army which had come to believe it knew everything.
Hooker abolished Burnside's grand divisions, returning the Army to its former organization of 7 corps, each with about 15,000 men. Hooker also introduced corps badges. These provided a sense of identity to the men and greatly improved the esprit de corps. Each division within a corps had a variation of that corps' badge in a different color. The badges were worn over their left breast or on the left side of their caps. The 6th Corps would soon distinguish itself under Major General John Sedgwick when they would finally capture the Marye's Heights at Fredericksburg. The 9th Corps was formed by General Burnside, and it followed him when he was transferred to the Western Theater. Hooker also greatly improved the Army's cavalry. Although the Confederacy had been making excellent use of cavalry under leaders such as Jeb Stuart, Joseph Wheeler, and Nathan Bedford Forrest, the Union's cavalry units were usually simply attached to the infantry corps and given little role in campaigns. Hooker created a unified cavalry command under General George Stoneman. As an indication of how this change improved the Union cavalry, Leonard Jordan, a private with the 10th Maine Battalion, later wrote,
"The cavalry of the Army of the Potomac had lately shown much pluck, and hereafter we were no more to hear the taunt, 'Who ever saw a dead cavalryman?' Nor was a squad of cavalry galloping to the rear past infantry on the march to be assailed by the cry, "Look out for fun ahead, boys. Cavalry to the rear."
Hooker had, as John Meade Gould said, improved the Army in 100 ways. Better officer training, better inspections, better food, better ambulance corps, better cavalry, and more. His men were rested and his army was large. With almost 134,000 men, his army dwarfed whatever forces the Confederacy could put in front of him. Lee's 60,000 troops occupied the heights south of the Rappahannock below Fredericksburg. They had fortified a 15-mile line. To move past Lee's fortifications would require strategy as well as force. At the end of April, Hooker made his move. 3 infantry corps, numbering about 70,000 men, moved secretly northwest up the Rappahannock, where they could ford the streams to Lee's north. 2 other corps, with 40,000 men, were to feign an attack on Fredericksburg, striking across at the same spot where the Union had met defeat in December. These corps were intended to tie down Lee's forces in Fredericksburg. At the same time, 10,000 cavalry were sent to raid behind Lee's rear, cutting his supply lines to Richmond and diverting his attention. The campaign began well for Hooker. By April 30th, Hooker had led his 70,000 infantry across the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers. They advanced to Chancellorsville, a major crossroads 9 miles west of Fredericksburg. They were now in a low, flat, wooded area, locally known as the Wilderness. Narrow roads and thick woods limited movement and visibility. Meanwhile, another 40,000 Union infantry demonstrated against Fredericksburg, holding Confederate attention there. For once, the Union Army seemed to have outmaneuvered Lee. The question that remained was, what would they do now? Having sent most of his cavalry on that failed mission to harass Lee's rear, Hooker now had no cavalry to warn him of General Lee's movements. And Lee was moving. While 1 brigade of cavalry kept Stoneman's cavalry under surveillance, the rest of the Confederate horsemen under Jeb Stuart had been shadowing Hooker and sending information back to Lee. Lee knew exactly where the bulk of Hooker's forces were and their strength. Confederate Major General Richard Anderson, whose infantry division were supporting Jeb Stuart's cavalry, fell back to a spot midway between Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg, called Tabernacle Church, and began fortifying a line there. Hooker, having convinced himself that Lee would retreat, failed to strike early while his forces were in a superior position. Abner Doubleday, a major general serving under Hooker, later described the events of that campaign.
In the present instance, it was simply suicidal for Hooker to delay action until Anderson had fortified his lines and Lee had come forward with the main body to join him. Hooker should have pressed on immediately to seize the objective, but he delayed action all that long night until 11 o'clock of the next morning. When he did make the effort, the line he was about to occupy was well fortified and held by all but 1 division and 1 brigade of Lee's army. On May 1st at 11 a.m., Hooker moved out from Chancellorsville to attack Lee in 4 columns. Sickles' corps was posted in the rear of the Chancellor House as a reserve. Stonewall Jackson, according to his invariable custom to find and fight his enemy as soon as possible, had moved forward from Tabernacle Church so that the 2 armies encountered each other about 2.5 miles from Chancellorsville. Altogether, the general line was a good one, for there were large open spaces where the artillery could move and maneuver, and the army were almost out of the thickets.
But Hooker, perhaps shocked by Lee's failure to retreat, ordered his troops back to Chancellorsville to take defensive positions. His subordinate officers protested. They would be surrendering the relatively high ground with its superior position for both artillery and infantry and withdrawing to the Wilderness, where their large numbers would be of much less importance. Despite their protests, the generals obeyed their orders and fell back to Chancellorsville, where they assumed a strong defensive position. Hooker still had about a 2-to-1 advantage over Lee in numbers, and he still expected Lee to retreat toward Richmond. But Lee had no intention of retreating. On the night of May 1st, Lee met with Jackson to plan an assault on the Union forces. While they were meeting, they received word from Jeb Stuart regarding the enemy's position.
Jackson at once asked permission to take his own corps, about 26,000 muskets, make a detour through the woods to conceal his march from observation and fall unexpectedly upon the weak point referred to by Stuart. If the 11th Corps had prepared for Jackson's approach by a line properly fortified with redoubts on the flanks, the men protected in front by felled timber and sheltered by breastworks, with the artillery at the angles crossing its fire in front, Jackson's corps would have been powerless to advance.
Just after 5 p.m., Jackson's forces attacked, screaming their rebel yell and driving all the animals of the forest before them. Jackson quickly rolled up the various brigades of Howard's corps. Some Union units made a valiant effort, but they were forced to retreat in a rout. Jackson pushed the Union right flank back 2 miles before sunset, when fresh Union troops put a halt to the advance. But Stonewall Jackson's tremendously impressive military success would be his last. That night, Jackson and a few other officers rode out ahead of the Confederate line, looking for weaknesses in the Union defenses so that the rebels could press their advantage. When they rode back to their own lines, they were mistaken for Union cavalry. Confederate infantry fired upon them in the confusion, and Jackson took 2 bullets in his left arm. The arm had to be amputated. While he lay recuperating, Stonewall Jackson contracted pneumonia. 8 days later, he died. May 3rd, the day after Jackson's successful attack, saw fierce fighting both at Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg. In the night, Hooker had sent word to Major General John Sedgwick that his 6th Corps should push through Fredericksburg towards Lee's rear. This meant attacking the trenches and stone wall that had thrown back Burnside's forces the previous December. This time, the result was a happier one for the Union. After being knocked back twice by Jubal Early's division defending Marie's Heights, Sedgwick's force was successful on its 3rd attempt. Back at Chancellorsville, Hooker was presented with opportunities for his units to strike at Confederate forces, but for some reason, he let those opportunities pass. Lee's forces consolidated and set up their artillery to pound Hooker's men. Hooker himself was knocked unconscious when a cannonball struck his tent. He quickly recovered and ordered a withdrawal, disappointing officers who wished to counterattack. In the face of Hooker's inactivity, Lee took a division the next day to put a stop to Sedgwick's advance. Without Sedgwick's force to distract Lee, Hooker felt his offensive could not go forward. He called council of war, asking his officers whether they felt they should withdraw. A majority of the officers preferred to stay and fight, but Hooker determined to withdraw nonetheless. Throughout the night of May 5th and in the early hours of May 6th, Hooker's forces withdrew across the river at the U.S. Ford. Their withdrawal frustrated Lee, who had planned another assault on the Union forces for the morning of the 6th. Lee had won the day, despite being outnumbered almost 2-1. But victory had come at a high cost. Of his 60,000 men involved in the campaign, over 13,000, 22%, were casualties. And in Jackson, the South lost one of its most able generals. Union losses were somewhat higher in numbers, about 17,000, but were only 13% of their forces. Given the Confederacy's limited manpower, it could ill afford those losses. It was, of course, a stunning victory for the Confederacy and a shocking loss for the Union. For years afterward, Hooker and his generals would point fingers at each other, declaring that the battle was lost because of either Hooker's timidity or his subordinates' incompetence. Almost a century and a half later, the U.S. Army Center of Military History summarized the cause of Confederate victory at Chancellorsville.
Actually, Lee's brilliant and daring maneuvers had defeated only one man, Hooker, and in no other action of the war did moral superiority of one general over the other stand out so clearly as a decisive factor in battle. Lee was so successful in part because Hooker made so many mistakes. Here again was a general who could effectively lead a body of troops under his own eyes, but could not use maps, reports, and messages to evaluate and control situations that were beyond his range of vision. Hooker, not the Army of the Potomac, lost the Battle of Chancellorsville.
The loss hurt morale in the North and boosted morale in the South. In particular, General Robert E. Lee's confidence in his army had grown so large that Virginia could not contain it. Believing his men were practically invincible, he determined to once again take the battle to the North. And so, the Army of Virginia moved from its greatest triumph to its greatest defeat. Gettysburg.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.